terms of arguments for access, in terms of child protection, are very different based on what kind of armed conflict you're in. And we're not good enough at this yet. We're not yet to the point where it's automatic that as soon as you think you've entered into hostilities, you have an internal reflection on this question. And I think in many cases, it may be security people that are in a position to say, we better have an understanding of this because we're going to see things changing very quickly outside of our door. So, the first type of armed conflict is international armed conflict. State attacks a state. In almost every case, that's our classic definition of armed conflict. It gets really complicated in situations like Somalia, where you say the TFG invited the United States to fight on its territory. The TFG invited Ethiopia to enter into Somali territory and fight. That can get much, much trickier. But in general, our qualification of an international armed conflict is a state attacks a state. I'm sorry, did I say invades earlier? That's incorrect. Delete that. It's not invade. You could send a bomb over, and that counts as an international armed conflict. Situations of occupation are a subset of international armed conflict. Right now in the world today, OPT is obviously the overriding example. Iraq was an example of this for about a year until the quote-unquote handover of sovereignty. Many argue that Western Sahara is an example of this. Cyprus continues technically to be an example of this. And we had a period, and there's a lot of disagreement about what this period was, in which Uganda occupied parts of Congo. It matters for the following reason. If you have a situation of occupation, the obligations of the occupying power suddenly get ratcheted way up. So you go from a situation of you're in an international armed conflict, both states have obligations to each other, to suddenly, boom, you drop the entire pile of obligations on the occupying power, on Israel, on the United States and Iraq, on Uganda, in the territory of Congo that they were occupying. Notice I didn't say Afghanistan. The United Nations cannot occupy a state. It's legally impossible. Kosovo is the closest argument that anyone's gotten to, but even that so far doesn't seem to satisfy anyone as an example. And the reason is because there is an agreement that the state consents to the presence of the United Nations mission on the ground, and that's why it's not an occupation. So we'll come back to some of the access arguments related to that, but it's pretty written. You're not going to be working in an occupation very frequently in your career unless you stay in the league. Non-international armed conflicts are situations of conflicts not of an international character. Now, it's a very weird definition, and the reason that it's weird is because we have two versions of this. One is rebels fighting the state. That's the classic example. Party comes up with a state, it wants to challenge the state's authority, and it engages in hostilities with the state. Most recent example where there was a big question about this was Kyrgyzstan over the summer. Was that an armed conflict? Was the violence that was happening in Kyrgyzstan enough for us to classify it as an armed conflict? I think the general answer was no, but certainly something to think about. I forgot to mention Georgia, Russia. Georgia, Russia is also an extremely bizarre and complicated story of occupation. So that's a live occupation question right now that anyone who works there will probably have to deal with. Non-international armed conflicts are by far and away the most common conflicts in which humanitarian agencies find themselves. Today, the vast majority of civilian deaths in armed conflict are in non-international armed conflicts. It used to be very different. It used to be in the era of world wars that international armed conflicts were by far and away the more common type of hostilities. Now we see that non-international armed conflicts taking over. Finally, situations short of an armed conflict, I would put Kyrgyzstan in that category. Violence, riots, death in the streets, some engagement with the military, shots are fired, but it's not a sustained violent situation that we would classify as an armed conflict. Some cases can be very complicated and hard to classify, but in general, the Burmese fighting that was happening about 3 years ago would go into this category. Nigeria still probably remains within this category. There's a lot of situations where the violence just doesn't seem to have reached the threshold yet where it applies. And the reason it matters is because until we cross this line, there's no IHO. There are no war crimes, there's no argument for access. That body of law does not get triggered until you find yourself in an armed conflict. Until you find yourself in a situation that you can classify as armed conflict. And let me just say, let me not go backwards, sorry, why it matters. You notice there is a difference between the two. And the difference is we have profoundly more law that applies to international armed conflict, fighting between states, than we do in non-international armed conflict. This is the type of conflict in which most children are dying. This is the type of conflict in which most children lack access to basic life-saving goods. This is the type of conflict that is raging in most of the world today. It is not the type of conflict that is most heavily regulated by law. So one of the real questions that we see, one of the real debates we see in this body of law today is how much of the law from international armed conflict influences the rules in internal armed conflicts, in non-international armed conflicts. And the reason for this is very simple. Sovereignty, as we said in the beginning. No state that was sitting around the table in 1949 and then in 1977 signing the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols wanted to say, we're going to write 100 rules for the way we can fight rebels on our own territory. They're rebels. They're fighting our authority on our sovereign territory. It's not for the international community to tell us how to fight them. It's our sovereign right to crush them, to disseminate, to destroy any threat from a rebel group. So yes, they agreed to some minimal rules, but for example, there is no prisoner of war status in a non-international armed conflict. And the reason for that is no state wanted to acknowledge that a rebel, an illegal fighter within their territory, could have prisoner of war status, could have the protections according to prisoner of war status, because of their own territory. It's a non-international armed conflict. It's within their territory. The complication we see today on this question is when these rules were drafted, it was very clear that international armed conflict was a state fighting a state. A non-international armed conflict was rebels fighting a state within a single territory. Today, most of ISAF members, NATO, most states, classify Afghanistan as a non-international armed conflict. The United States and Iraq classify the United States and the UK classify Iraq as a non-international armed conflict. Israel classified the invasion of southern Lebanon in 2006 as a non-international armed conflict, and Somalia and Yemen are both today considered non-international armed conflicts. And Pakistan doesn't even consider itself to be an armed conflict. So my point is to say that I don't think it's a coincidence that this definition seems to be expanding to include conflicts that, at least to my eye, seem like there are multiple states involved in a conflict. This is an area where many of the rules don't apply with the same force and strength as they do in an interstate war, in an international armed conflict. So again, it is very, very important for us to understand wherever we are operating, and it could change, right? Sri Lanka has morphed over the last 2 or 3 years. There are situations that may be moving between different stages, but it's important for us to have some sense of whether or not, I'm not saying you sit alone in your office and come up with a qualification, but this conversation should be happening if there is a change going on, or if there is armed conflict going on, if there are hostilities going on. Yeah, Paul.
This all begs the question, if there's different categories and different rules, and the final determination of categories is a question of opinion based on the states, what arbitrator is there for them to know opinion from fact?
Yeah. So